Hollywood gave you one version of Tombstone, a town of lawmen and outlaws, defined by a 30-second gunfight in an alleyway. That image is a distraction. The real Tombstone was defined by something far more dangerous, a 30-mile iron pipe. In 1881, the most powerful men in Arizona were not carrying six-shooters. They were carrying the keys to the water valves. This is the real story of the Tombstone water scam, 20 shocking truths about how a corporate monopoly bankrupted a town, and why the water you drank was actually more expensive than the whiskey you bought. Picture the Sonoran Desert in the late 1870s. Parched earth cracked into geometric patterns under a sun that treats everything beneath it as something to be reduced. Sagebrush and cactus occupy the ground that nothing more ambitious has managed to claim. A town is rising in the middle of this landscape, false front buildings going up along unpaved streets, horses drinking from wooden troughs outside saloons, iron wrenches, and pipe fittings stacked on workbenches beside the kind of official-looking documents that men in suits sign when they are about to own something that other people need. Tombstone, Arizona, in 1879, was not yet a town anyone had heard of. It would become the most famous boomtown in American history, famous for a gunfight that lasted 30 seconds, while the real story of what controlled and ultimately destroyed that town was written not in gunpowder, but in the terms and conditions of a water contract that 15,000 people had no choice but to accept. Fact 20. Silver was discovered in the hills outside what would become Tombstone in 1877 by a prospector named Ed Schieffelin. He had been warned by soldiers at Fort Huachuca that the only thing he would find in that territory was his tombstone. He named the town accordingly. Within 3 years, Tombstone had a population of between 10,000 and 15,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the Arizona Territory. It had newspapers, hotels, an opera house, and saloons that never fully closed. It had everything a boomtown needed except the one thing no desert town can improvise: water. The silver was there. The ambition was there. The population arrived faster than any infrastructure could accommodate it. And the men who understood what that combination of desert geography and explosive population growth meant for the price of water were already positioning themselves before most of the miners had unpacked. Fact 19. The geography of Tombstone was not incidental to the water monopoly that would come to define the town. It was the precondition of it. Tombstone sits at an elevation of roughly 4,500 feet in the Sulphur Springs Valley, surrounded by ranges that block easy access to reliable surface water. The San Pedro River runs several miles to the west, too far to serve the town's daily needs without significant infrastructure. The Huachuca Mountains to the southwest held springs and surface water at elevation, accessible through a canyon called Sycamore. The men who understood early that Tombstone's population would outrun any improvised water solution began surveying Sycamore Canyon before the town had fully materialized. They were not engineers driven by civic purpose. They were investors who had identified a choke point and intended to own it. The real Tombstone currency was not silver. It was moisture. And the men who controlled the moisture controlled everything that depended on it. Fact 18. The Huachuca Water Company secured a monopoly on Tombstone's water supply through a combination of early positioning, capital investment, and documented political relationships with the Tombstone City Council, relationships that made competing with the company's infrastructure effectively impossible for any independent operator. The company's central achievement was the Sycamore Canyon Pipeline, 30 miles of iron pipe laid across desert terrain that brought water from the Huachuca Mountains into Tombstone. It was, by the standards of the Arizona Territory in 1880, a genuine engineering accomplishment. It was also a franchise, a system whose capital investment was used to justify exclusive control over a resource that no resident of Tombstone could survive without. The company did not build the pipeline out of civic generosity. It built the pipeline to own the delivery of water to 15,000 people who had no alternative source. Here's the bill that Hollywood never showed you. Fact 17. At peak pricing in the early 1880s, a gallon of fresh water in Tombstone cost as much as 3 cents. That figure requires context to understand, because 3 cents does not sound like much until it is placed inside the wage and expense structure of a Tombstone miner. A miner in Tombstone in 1880 earned approximately $3 a day. $3 a day, 7 days a week if work was available, was the economic baseline of a man doing physical labor in a silver mine in the Arizona Territory. A gallon of water at 3 cents meant that 100 gallons, a quantity that sounds large until you account for drinking, cooking, washing, and any mining use, cost $3. 1 full day's wages for 100 gallons of water. Think about what that math actually meant for a thirsty man. The water company did not need to charge extraordinary rates to extract an extraordinary share of a miner's income. It needed only to charge rates that were calibrated to absorb the maximum amount a man could pay while still retaining enough to keep working. The survival tax was not accidental. It was arithmetic. Fact 16. The comparison between the price of water and the price of whiskey in Tombstone is documented and precise enough to measure how thoroughly the water company had captured the economics of daily life in the town. At peak water pricing, a gallon of water cost as much as a gallon of cheap whiskey in a Tombstone saloon. That parity is not a coincidence. And it is not because whiskey was unusually affordable. It reflects the systematic elevation of water pricing to the absolute ceiling of what a consumer economy in a desert boomtown would bear. The saloon operators who sold whiskey understood that the comparison was bad for business. A man who could buy alcohol for the same price as water had every incentive to make the purchase that at least offered a social return. The water company apparently calculated that survival needs would sustain demand regardless of the price comparison. They were correct. The more they mined, the more they paid for the air and water they needed to do it. Fact 15. The industrial water rate, the price charged to independent miners and small mining operations for the water required to process silver ore, operated on a different and more extractive schedule than the residential rate. Processing silver ore requires water for what miners called washing, separating ore from waste rock through water-intensive techniques that consumed large volumes per day. For a small independent miner running a modest operation, the industrial water charge represented a fixed cost that had to be covered before any revenue from silver could be counted as profit. The Huachuca Water Company set industrial rates that ensured a significant fraction of every silver recovery went directly to the water account. They did not need to own a silver mine. They owned the water that every silver mine required, and the price of that water was set against the value of what the water helped produce. Sound familiar? The monopoly did not die. It just became a utility company. Fact 14. The bath was Tombstone's most transparent display of the water monopoly's capacity for extraction. A bath in a Tombstone bathhouse, meaning a tub, hot water, and the time to use it, cost a documented premium that reflected not the labor involved in heating and delivering the water, but the underlying cost of acquiring the water in the first place. The bathhouse operator was not extracting the customer. He was himself a downstream customer of the water company, forced to build the company's margin into his own price before adding any profit for himself. The chain of extraction ran from the Huachuca Mountains, through 30 miles of iron pipe, through the water company's meters and accounts, through the bathhouse operator's pricing, and into the pocket of every man who wanted to remove a week's worth of mine dust before presenting himself in a saloon. Hollywood sold you a gunfight. The ledger sold you a scam with better infrastructure. Fact 13. The ice trade in Tombstone demonstrates how comprehensively the water monopoly captured adjacent markets once the core infrastructure was in place. Because the Huachuca Water Company controlled both the water supply and the means of transporting it, the company was positioned to control the production and distribution of ice, a commodity of significant commercial value in a desert town where saloons depended on cold drinks to drive business, and where food preservation in summer temperatures required refrigeration that only ice could provide. Ice was sold to Tombstone saloons at markups documented at over 500% compared to prices in Tucson. The saloon owner who needed ice to keep his drinks cold and his food from spoiling paid the water company's rate, or did without. The miners who drank at the saloon paid the saloon owner's rate, which incorporated the ice markup, which incorporated the water company's monopoly pricing, which incorporated the exclusive franchise the city council had granted. The extraction was layered, and the layers were each documented. Fact 12. The Tombstone City Council's relationship with the Huachuca Water Company was documented not as a regulator overseeing a utility, but as a political structure that had been substantially captured by the financial interests of the water company and its associated investors. Attempts by citizens and independent entrepreneurs to drill deep-bore wells that would have introduced competitive water sourcing into the Tombstone market were blocked at the council level through a series of regulatory and permitting decisions that effectively preserved the pipeline monopoly against any challenge from below ground. A deep-bore well, if successfully completed, would have given its owner access to water that did not pass through the company's meters, water that could be sold at prices the company could not control. The council blocked it. The documented record of those proceedings is not a record of civic deliberation about the merits of competing water sources. It is a record of a municipal body acting on behalf of the monopoly. It was theoretically empowered to regulate. They did not fight for justice. They fought for the pipeline. Fact 11. The men who sat on the Tombstone City Council in the early 1880s were not anonymous bureaucrats. They were documented participants in the commercial economy of Tombstone, with business relationships and investment interests that overlapped with the water company's ownership and its dependent industries in ways that would be recognizable today as conflicts of interest requiring disclosure or recusal. The same men who voted on water franchises owned saloons that purchased ice from the water company's distribution network. The same men who blocked well drilling permits held land whose value depended on the continued operation of the pipeline that served it. The political economy of Tombstone was not a story of corruption in the sense of secret payments made in dark rooms. It was a story of a small class of men whose financial interests were so thoroughly aligned with the monopoly's continuation that no secret payment was required. The alignment was the corruption. Fact 10. The Great Fire of 1881 was the first documented test of whether the Huachuca Water Company could perform the function that justified a monopoly franchise on a town's water supply. A fire in a wooden frontier town, built with the speed and material economy of a boom town, was not unlikely. It was a near certainty, and the city's fire suppression capacity depended entirely on the water pressure available in the company's hydrant system. When the fire of June 1881 broke out and spread through Tombstone's commercial district, the documented pressure in the company's hydrants was negligible. Fire crews attempting to suppress the blaze found that the system they had been told to rely on did not deliver water at the volumes or pressures required to fight a structure fire in progress. The fire burned through a significant portion of the commercial district before it exhausted itself. The water company's administrative infrastructure survived. Fact 9. The fire of May 1882 tested the same system under nearly identical conditions, and it produced nearly identical results. A second major fire swept through Tombstone's business district, causing documented losses that represented a significant fraction of the town's accumulated commercial investment. The hydrant system again failed to deliver adequate pressure for fire suppression. Citizens who had paid the water company's rates for 2 years, who had accepted the monopoly's franchise on the grounds that the infrastructure it maintained would protect the town, watched a second time as the system that was supposed to protect them was absent at the moment it was needed. Think about what that math actually meant for a thirsty man watching his livelihood burn. The survival tax had been collected. The survival infrastructure had not been maintained. The company had optimized for revenue and not for the function that revenue was supposed to purchase. Fact 8. The documented failure of water pressure during both fires raises a question the historical record does not answer with certainty, but the documented facts strongly suggest 2 possibilities. 1. The inadequate pressure during the fires reflected a system built to a standard insufficient for fire suppression. 2. The system was capable of higher pressure, but the operators chose not to provide it during the emergency. Both explanations are damaging in different ways. A system built inadequately was a fraud sold to a town under false pretenses of safety. A system withheld during an emergency was something more deliberate. What the documented record establishes is simple. The company collected its fees. The fires burned. The pressure was insufficient, and no meaningful accountability followed. The fires destroyed buildings. The franchise survived intact. Fact 7. The aftermath of the 1882 fire accelerated a decline in Tombstone's fortunes. That decline was already in motion for reasons the monopoly had not caused, but had certainly not helped. The silver mines that were the economic foundation of the town had begun flooding with underground water, a separate and ironic water problem that the Huachuca Water Company's surface pipeline was of no use in solving. The pumps required to keep the deep mines operational were expensive, and the economics of the deepest silver claims were deteriorating. Population began to decline. The tax base that had made the water company's franchise so valuable started to erode. The town that had supported 15,000 people at its peak contracted toward the small city it would eventually become. The water company had extracted its margins for the duration of the boom. When the boom ended, the pipeline continued to serve a diminished population at rates that left residents with no real alternative but to pay. Fact 6. The modern utility monopoly, the single provider of electricity, natural gas, or water to a residential or commercial customer who has no practical alternative to the service, is the direct institutional descendant of the Huachuca Water Company's franchise model. The specific elements are the same. Exclusive territorial rights secured through regulatory or political process, infrastructure investment used to justify the exclusivity, pricing set without meaningful competitive pressure, and a municipal or regulatory body whose independence from the monopoly's financial interests is documented as incomplete. The names on the utility bills changed. The franchise model did not. Sound familiar? The monopoly did not die. It filed for a rate increase. Fact 5. The Tombstone water monopoly's most durable achievement was not the pipeline itself. The pipeline was iron and eventually corroded. The monopoly's durable achievement was the demonstration that a basic survival resource delivered through infrastructure too expensive for any individual or small cooperative to replicate could be priced as a luxury rather than as a necessity, and that the population depending on it had no practical recourse. That demonstration did not stay in Tombstone. It traveled with the investors and the lawyers and the political models that had made it work, and it was replicated in water systems, gas lines, electrical grids, and telecommunications, infrastructure across the American West, and eventually across the country. The lesson of Tombstone was not learned by the miners who paid 3 cents a gallon. It was learned by the men who said it. Fact 4. The citizens of Tombstone who wanted to drill competing wells were not romantic individualists trying to escape corporate control for ideological reasons. They were pragmatic people who understood that a single-source water supply in a desert town created an existential vulnerability to monopoly pricing, vulnerability to service failure during emergencies, and vulnerability to the financial interests of a small group of investors whose incentives were not aligned with the welfare of the people they served. The city council blocked the wells anyway. The regulatory capture was complete enough that the most obvious solution to the monopoly problem, introducing a competing source, was foreclosed through the same political mechanisms the monopoly had helped install. The residents paid. The fires burned. The council blocked the wells. This is what infrastructure extortion looks like when it is operating correctly. Fact 3. The saloon economy of Tombstone is generally presented in popular history as the entertainment infrastructure of a wild frontier town. The gambling, the drinking, the social life of a place where men with money and no fixed obligations spent what they earned. That presentation omits the water company's position at the base of the saloon economy. The saloons bought ice from the water company's distribution network at 500% markups over Tucson prices. The saloons bought water for the bar, the kitchen, and for the bathhouse operations many of them ran as secondary businesses. The saloon owners were downstream customers of the monopoly, paying inflated rates for the inputs that made their businesses viable, and incorporating those rates into the prices they charged the miners who were already paying the water company directly for their residential and industrial water. The extraction was not parallel. It was sequential. Every dollar a miner earned passed through the water company's pricing at least twice before it could be spent on anything else. Fact 2. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted approximately 30 seconds on October 26, 1881. 3 men died. It became the most documented event in the history of Tombstone and one of the most documented events in the history of the American West. In the same calendar year, the Great Fire burned through Tombstone's commercial district while the water company's hydrants ran dry. The fire caused losses that dwarfed the economic cost of the gunfight by any measure, and it affected every business owner and resident in the destroyed district, rather than 3 men in an alleyway. The gunfight generated a mythology that persists to the present day. The fire generated an insurance claim. Hollywood needed a story with heroes and villains identifiable by their hats. The water company's franchise and the fire that the franchise's infrastructure failed to suppress did not offer that clarity. The villain was a board of directors. The weapon was a water meter. The victims were everyone. That story is harder to film. That is why it was not filmed. Fact 1. Here is what Tombstone actually was. It was a laboratory for the model that would govern the delivery of essential infrastructure in American cities for the next 150 years. A resource identified. A monopoly secured through early investment and political relationships. A franchise granted by a regulatory body that the monopoly had helped populate. Prices set at the ceiling of what survival necessity would bear. Competing supply blocked through the same political mechanisms that granted the original franchise. And when the system failed at the moment it was most needed, when the fires burned and the hydrants ran dry, no accountability followed, because the people who might have demanded accountability were paying the rates that made accountability inconvenient. The gunfight at the OK Corral is history because it is containable. 30 seconds. 3 bodies. A clear narrative. The water scam is not history in the same way because it never ended. The Huachuca Water Company's franchise model became the template for the utility bill sitting in your inbox right now. The survival tax is still being collected. The only thing that changed is that it arrives on the 15th of the month and they accept direct deposit. If you lived in Tombstone, would you pay for the water or buy the whiskey? Let us know in the comments. And next time, we are looking at the outlaw math and why 20 of the most famous bandits of the West actually died penniless, while the men who hunted them collected government salaries and land grants. The numbers are not what the mythology says they are.